What's up, guys? Marcellus Williams, aka TheSwolefessor, here to catch you on health, fitness, social well-being. I'm here with my boy Derek Akunne, fellow lifter, former NFL football player, and in my opinion, the man who will be the bridge that gaps powerlifting and physical therapy. Because right now it is god awful, bro. I'm not gonna lie to you. It's not all that good. But today we're gonna be talking to you guys about static stretching and specifically why we believe, based upon the research, powerlifters should not be doing it. Period. At all. This is something that, you know, I've talked about briefly here and there on the channel. You guys know there's even a point in time where I was more open to the idea of trying to do certain static stretches, a bunch of foam rolling, things like that. But you guys know that I'm I'm all about the evidence and just looking collectively at the research and discussing this stuff with Derek, and as he's gone through his physical therapy courses and has dove even deeper into the research than what I have myself. That is the conclusion that we've come to, that it's not worth doing, that there's a lot of detriment that can actually come with it, and that there's just way too many alternatives that are better, both from a time management perspective as well as just being more beneficial for what we do as powerlifters, to even consider doing any type of static stretching. So we're gonna get into that. We're gonna go over what a lot of those alternatives are, and then also just give you guys a little bit of our personal experience with it ourselves, as well as things that I've gone through with my clients. So to start off, guys, just we say static stretching, we're just talking about any time that you're sitting, lying, or seated in a static hold for a certain duration of time. So reach down, touch your toes, hold it for 10 seconds, things like that. So with that being said, Derek, you want to kind of get into just essentially kind of collectively what the research shows, and then give us a few examples more directly.
Okay. So pretty much collectively what we see in literature is that pretty much static stretching can acutely decrease strength, power output, performance. Just in general, we know that based on literature, stretching isn't great to be done before working out. So kind of what we've gotten to now is people kind of start to suggest okay, stretching isn't great to do before working out, but let's stretch after you work out.
Yeah.
So people we'll start to say okay, well, just not stretch beforehand, we'll stretch afterwards. Mm-hmm. So in my mind, based on what I've read in the literature and the available evidence I've read, I don't think that's a great idea either. Yeah. So in my mind, we're gonna talk later about why it's not great from a time management standpoint to stretch, because there's better options. But for me, all the research and stuff will be in the description below. Mm-hmm. But essentially, there's a study they did. Can't remember the exact country they did it out of. And this is for performance. This is one for a strength training. This one particularly for performance. So they took about 17 junior league soccer players, and they ran them through a performance test. They did a 30-meter sprint, 5-time multiple jump, repeated sprint test, and a couple other performance tests. And they had 3 groups essentially. They had one group who did static stretching. They had one group who did dynamic stretching, which is just kind of going actively through a range. Mm-hmm. And they had one group who did nothing at all. Right. Pretty much. They didn't do warm up. They just didn't do anything. So what they did was, before they did all this stuff, they tested them on all these parameters, all these performances that they did them. Then they ran them through, they ran the stretching group through the static stretching. I believe the static stretching was two sets of 30 seconds per body part. So they did quads, hamstrings, I think abductors. They pretty much did 2 sets of 30 for the static stretching, and they did an equivalent amount of time for the dynamic stretching. And then they had them go through the stretching groups, right? So then they brought them back 24 hours later. So they came back 24 hours later. They didn't do any more stretching. They didn't do anything like that, and they tested them again. Mm-hmm. So they went through, tested them, ran all the tests again. And they saw that the dynamic stretching group actually performed a little bit better than they did the day before. Mm-hmm. The control group was a little bit better, about the same. Mm-hmm. But the static stretching group, all their numbers were down significantly.
So even compared to the group that didn't do anything?
Yes, compared to the group that didn't do anything, they did significantly worse. Okay. Compared to that group and compared to what they did the day before. Mm-hmm. So what you see was that the group who did static stretching, they tested them, the static stretching, came back 24 hours later, tested again, and they did worse.
And their performance was still down. So in application of powerlifting, even if you don't stretch before that session you're doing that day, right? Just from stretching afterwards, you're potentially impacting your performance for your training the following day. And for a little bit of like, just kind of think about a little bit practically, if we think about it, guys, in terms of powerlifting, right? Because what's the main reason that we hear people like, oh, I feel tight, I feel tension. Well, first of all, this is powerlifting. To a degree, we want that. We want a certain amount of tension. We want a certain amount of tightness. The idea of, okay, I'm going to stretch and basically loosen this muscle, right, in exchange for power loss doesn't make sense at all when it comes to what we're trying to do for powerlifting. Especially when we think about the fact that, like Derek noted, the group that did the dynamic movements, they came in and performed better. Because technically speaking, if you're going through a dynamic range of motion, right, like a full range of motion, you're gonna get that brief stretch and contraction versus just holding that stretched position for 15, 20, 45 seconds. So with what we do, which is dynamic in nature, when you squat, you go into the hole, you come back up. When you bench, you touch your chest, you press. With deadlift, you go to the bar, you grab, you come back up. There's never ever really a need for us to be like just in a static position for that long, especially if it's gonna cause that type of performance detriment. And then beyond that, like I said, for example, with clients, I've had so many clients who come to me, right, where they would do a bunch of static stretching either before or after, and yet they would still always come back in and feel like, oh, I still feel tired, I still feel beat up. And it's almost like they make themselves relying on these more like passive modalities, where when we cut a lot of that stuff out and have them focus more on just like, dynamic work or basic like mobility work where they're actually moving through a range of motion, not only does it save them time, but they feel way better. And even a lot of these issues they feel like, oh, I'm always feeling tight here and there, seems to dissipate. And that's because, like, in my opinion, and even what you and I talked about, Derek, when research shows, movement 9.9 times out of 10 is going to be your solution. Not a bunch of static stretching, not a bunch of passive modalities, not manual therapy, not foam rolling. It's going to be movement, because the body's not made to be sedentary. And the more you move your body through these ranges of motion, the more comfortable it tends to feel in those positions anyway.
Exactly. And because I would say with this one is that even though they're looking at like power output, essentially, which is different than like powerlifting where we're doing like just moving weight, like just outputting force, which is different than like power. Right. But in my mind, like I said, with what we know with the other literature, what the literature says about stretching and like a natural strength performance, is that to me, this is just another example of another reason where like maybe we don't want to do this, because you want to think about like if you're stretching after your training session, and you come back the next day and your performance is still down. So you got to think about the cumulative effect of that. Which is kind of a good segue into like the next study I want to talk about. So this next study, another one, I'm not exactly sure the country. I think it's maybe somewhere in Europe. They took 30 trained athletes. So in this study, they determined to be trained if you had been a year of training experience, 4 days a week, at least like an hour and a half of a training session, you've been doing weight training pretty much. So it took 30 people, and they split up into 3 groups. One group didn't do any stretching. I think they did like a general like dynamic warm-up. Second group, they did stretching before they lifted. So, and the stretching was something simple, like a set of 30 horizontal abduction, a set of 30 stretching like that, a set of 30 with a quad stretch, and then a set of 30 with a hamstring stretch. It's 30 seconds each. Simple as that, right? Then they had a third group who did stretching, so before they would do a particular lift, they were stretched. They were stretched like interset, like before the sets they would stretch. Okay, so in the second group, they did all their stretching before any of the lifting, and in the third group, they would stretch before each individual lift. Yes, exactly. But the time was still the same. It wasn't like they were doing stretching each time, but they would stretch before a particular lift. So if they were going to do leg extension, they would stretch before they did leg extension. Gotcha. If they were going to do hamstring curls, they would do the 30-second stretch before they did their set of hamstring curls. Gotcha. Essentially. So in the study, they went through, that was like the parameters in the groups. They looked at IGF-1, which is pretty much kind of a marker for we think helps with hypertrophy. So with this marker, they just thought that this marker is pretty much a marker of hypertrophy, what this body, your blood, and your muscle need for hypertrophy. They tested IGF-1 levels, and they tested 8 rep max strength. So I think the parameters were leg extension, lat pull down, hamstring curl, and not exactly sure what the last one was, but it was like they test like 4 tests, 8 rep max, to kind of determine like their strength and then the IGF-1 levels. So, and they ran through 10 weeks, 3 days a week of training. All the sets, like it was like 4 sets of 8 to 10 on everything, except for like they did lumbar, pretty much trunk flexion extension. They did like sets of 20 on it, essentially. And they tested their 8 rep max before and used that to pretty much like determine what they needed to do in the weight room, and they progressed them as needed once they hit like a 10 rep max in training easily. So at the end of the 10 weeks, they saw that in the strength training only group, so they pretty much the strength training only group increased in all their lifts.
Okay.
So all their lifts increased. They had like 20 to 30% increase in all their like 8 rep maxes in every single lift. And the stretching beforehand, they increased their strength, I believe only in the leg extension and lat pull down. Their 8 rep max increased.
Okay.
And then in the stretching before the sets, they only increased their max in the lat pull down.
Okay.
So, but even then, the strength improvement seen in the no stretching group was still significantly greater than the strength in the other groups, even when they did.
Even when they did improve.
Yeah,
Okay.
it was still significantly greater in the no stretch group. And this is over 10 weeks, and they test at the end of the 10 weeks. Also, at the end of the 10 weeks, the IGF-1 levels were only significantly higher in the group that didn't stretch. So, in my mind, what this is showing is that for whatever reason, over this course of 10 weeks, stretching either beforehand or either before at the beginning or stretching before each lift, for whatever reason, was inhibiting their strength. They were still able to get stronger in some of these lifts, but just not as strong as they could have essentially, maybe theoretically, because they were stretching.
Because they were stretching, yeah. And as we've talked about on the channel before, guys, we know that, once you got your technique down, your programming structure, your volume dosage, the main thing that's going to help you get stronger is getting more jacked, hypertrophy. So even if we say in an individual session, it's a negligible difference of how much muscle you can build if you stretch versus if you don't, over time, because that's just 10 weeks. Well, think about how much muscle you can build in, say, like a year. And now you take a little bit of that percentage off for every single session you go in due to stretching, if that's the case, right? It's already hard enough to build muscle as a natural lifter, especially the longer you've been training. Yeah. So we want to stay on top of every variable that we can as far as that. And it seems to me that what you're saying is that possibly, even though they don't necessarily know why yet, that could be shortchanging your muscle growth even more.
Exactly.
And even if it's not beyond that, just purely from the performance standpoint, since ultimately that's what it's about, right? Like what we can do the day of is a performance standpoint. And I know for both, like I said, I've got several examples with clients, but even just for both Derek and I, because we both went through a period of time where we were doing more static stretching, more foam rolling, due to the coach that we were under at the time, getting us a little bit more open behind it. And even though, yeah, there will be some times where like, oh, this feels good in the moment, or oh, I feel more like, loose now or whatever. What I found for me especially, like, not necessarily being like, built as well for powerlifting as you, it nerfed me hard because I wouldn't feel as explosive coming out the hole. I wouldn't feel tension. So whereas the moment I got away from that, because I got away from it, I want to say it was around February of last year when I really started like testing, like, okay, I'm not going to do any type of static stuff, no foam rolling, purely just dynamic work movement. And my body immediately started feeling that much better on all three lifts, even like with a bunch of my accessory work and just moving throughout the day. I felt good. I didn't feel the need to have to like go into static positions and hold them for as long.
Exactly. And I would say that, like, if you think about it, it makes sense to me, right? So if we know acutely that static stretching will diminish your strength, right? We know acutely it will do that. It will diminish how much force you can output. We know, and then like I said, based on the other stuff, we know potentially that effect can last for 24 hours, potentially, right? So especially thinking about like a powerlifter who's training primarily through RPE,
Yep.
where you're going to be limited by how much weight you can do.
Yeah.
Essentially, not like you have like a percentage that you have to hit this weight.
Yeah.
So if you're going off purely off RPE and your force output is diminished, think about that every time you go into train. You go into squat, and now you can't squat as much just because you don't have that force output because of stretching.
Yeah.
So think about that. So now you're just not lifting as heavy as you could have because of the stretching. And then to that cumulative effect of that over time, think about how much that can build over a month of training, 2 months of training, a year of training. Think about like what you're leaving on the table. You'll like you'll get stronger because you're training.
Sure.
Think about how much you're leaving on the table because of that.
Yeah.
Potentially.
Or even if you were assigned a percentage where maybe 75% doesn't really feel like 75% anymore because you can't produce that same force that you usually would. So even in that same thing, it's almost, and then if we think about it, because really like you said, the main benefit of static stretching is usually like that temporary increase in range of motion, right? But it's this thing where, as we both know, and I've said on the show before, like strength training is mobility training. You want to get better at squatting to depth, squat more. Over time, you're going to get better at getting in that position and maintaining tension in that position. So the idea of, okay, I'm going to cut my power output, right, of 24 hours just to temporarily get this increased range of motion, when that range of motion is going to come over time anyway, just from doing the movements and doing them loaded, doesn't make sense. And even if you can't, and in my mind, I'm not saying you have to just go in and get on the barbell, right? Like I'm not necessarily going to that extreme. Mind you, I'm a big believer in it's about how you feel that day. If you're feeling good enough to just get on the barbell, do it. But if you are feeling like, getting in this position feels uncomfortable, grab a dumbbell or a kettlebell, do a few goblet squats, right? Something like that where you are practicing getting to that range of motion, but you're doing it in a way that's one, loaded, which is gonna help you more like as far as practicing tensioning and stability, and two, you're not going to get any of the detriments. You're still working through that range of motion, but without the power loss, which to me makes way more sense. Now, as far as like just the time duration, Derek, what would you say, like for you, back when we were doing more static stuff, typically how long would it take you to get through like your mobility and your static forms before you even got into the barbell?
I'll get in the gym and I think maybe 30, 45 minutes. Like if I'm like, okay, I'll do my stretch, I'll foam roll, do my stretches, try to make sure everything's like make sure I'm loosened up. And I'll take maybe 30, 45 minutes just before I even got into the bar. Yeah,
same thing with me. It'd be like sometimes 45 minutes to an hour because I would get to this point where, and that's another thing too, the kind of like the psychology behind this stuff. Like I said, you almost form this dependency where you think you need certain things. So whenever I would feel something that would be tight that usually isn't, my first thought would be, oh, I gotta throw in another movement for this. And I kept adding more and more stuff in until like, yo, I've been at the gym for an hour and haven't even gotten into the barbell yet. Whereas now, legit, my warm-ups can take me like 5-10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes if I want to go through each thing a couple of times. But it's like I get in, I go through my movements. You guys have seen like just a few videos ago for my prep, I showed you like, hey, what I basically do before like I squat, bench, and deadlift, and it takes no time at all. And some of you have already like messaged me like, hey man, I started incorporating these to my warm-ups. I feel great, and I'm not in the gym for anywhere near as long because it becomes this thing where with powerlifting training specifically, we're already in there for a long time, and we can be in there 2, 3, 5 hours. One of the main reasons why Derek's not so much into powerlifting as much anymore because of how long it can take. So to shave off that 45 minutes can help you so much, as well as just getting into the zone. Like when I get to the gym, I'm usually driving there, I'm blasting music, I'm getting myself ready. So to go there and then, well, okay, well, time to lay on my back for 45 minutes before I do anything, it kind of just gets me out of the zone psychologically as well.
For sure. Like I said, yeah, if you're feeling like you need a foam roll for an hour before you're training because you're sore or you're feeling tight, that's something where you start thinking like, okay, I'm foam rolling every time I come to the gym, the same areas, the same time, I'm spending an hour on it. Like that's when you start thinking about, especially from like a coach's standpoint, like, what's going on programming wise, training wise, because we know like fatigue can manifest as like tightness, muscles not, I feel like you can't feel the muscle as well. So we know fatigue can manifest as those kind of things. You gotta think about like from training wise, like you gotta maybe ask your coach, like if you're a coach looking at your athletes, like what do we need to change or what are we doing different? We need to do differently to manage this versus kind of just foam rolling, numbing the area a little bit, desensitizing it, and then getting under the bar and having to do that every single time. You know, like time is money. Especially if you have a job, you're getting off work, you need to go train. If you're not like a kid or a guy, person has like all day to train, maybe you only have 2 hours to train.
Exactly.
You want to maximize your time in the gym.
Exactly. Or even like my client Brandon Petrie, who was like going through some issues like with his glute and his hamstring and everything like that. The first thing we addressed with him was just the volume dosage. Make sure the programming was set up in a way that was effective, and that alone did so much for us to where he was able to squat twice a week as usual, pull, bench, or like that. And then beyond that, we met up with Derek and got a few more drills to do, but nothing he gave us was static. It was all like, movement, activation, just to get things feel like they're more fired off. And now at this point, he's not even having to do all of those. That's another thing. A lot of these stuff, like these, movements that you may get and start doing, even with those, the dynamic ones, you don't have to do them all the time. They're tools on an as-need basis. We don't ever want to become overly reliant on them, because if we are relying on this stuff, it means we're feeling the same thing all the time. And if we're feeling the same thing all the time, we need to be thinking about, okay, what's causing this? Why are we feeling this? And how can we address it? Which usually with powerlifting is going to be from programming. I mean, think about it. You guys see people with all different types of form, some good, some bad. And a lot of these people that have this great form seem like they're always in pain all the time. You got these other people where the form may look like trash to you, but they have no issues. So that alone tells you that it goes beyond just certain positions and fancy movement and things like that. But on that point, Derek, because you brought up the foam rolling, so collectively, because that's something else that even some powerlifters who understand, don't static stretch, they'll still spend a lot of time foam rolling. So what does the research kind of show collectively as far as foam rolling?
So collectively, as far as foam rolling go, from research I've read, there's no research showing that foam rolling is necessarily detrimental. I think there might be like a few, like a meta-analysis where they show like a small, maybe like decrease in like sprint performance with foam rolling. But I haven't personally seen anything saying that foam rolling decreases strength or like significantly decreases performance. Of course, like you do see research that shows that like it gives you like a temporary increase in your motion. Yeah. So from that standpoint, I feel like if I tell people personally, if you want a foam roll and it feels good, go for it. You have the time to, and it's like if you have 2 hours of your training and you want to do like 5 minutes of foam rolling, cool. If you have 2 hours of training and you want to do 30 minutes of foam rolling, then I'm like, all right, maybe you need to like cut back on that a little bit. When it comes to stretching, I'll tell people like, hey, you probably shouldn't be stretching. But foam rolling, I'm more of a standpoint of if you want to do it,
like
it
as
feels good.
Basis.
If you want to do that to training, and you have time for it, go for it. If you're on a time crunch and you need it to maximize your time, then I probably don't want to grab a foam roll.
Yeah, and what I tell my clients is I'm like, hey, look, if you're doing it and you like get that temporary increased range of motion, or even just something seems like, oh, this feels good right now for a few minutes, I have no issue with that. I do tell my clients to be careful when they once again form this almost dependency mindset where like nothing feels off, nothing feels bad, but they're like, oh, I'm a foam roll just in case. Because I think at that point, okay, we're developing once again this kind of dependency on something that's more passive in actuality. Because even though it hasn't been shown to cause a whole lot of detriment, aside from the increased range of motion, it hasn't been shown to do a lot of these magical things that people think foam rolling does either, like releasing lactic acid and all that type of like nonsense. It hasn't been shown to do that either. So foam rolling is one of those things where I tell people like, hey, if doing this for a little bit feels good, that's fine. But once again, don't get caught in this mindset that you need it, because we know that movement is going to be king. And that's the main thing I want to drive home too. If you're going to do anything, it should be movement based. Like if you only have 15 minutes to warm up and you can choose to foam roll for 15 minutes, static stretch, or do some dynamic movement, 100% of the time I will say undeniably you should be doing dynamic movement. Like the research is very clear on that, and just practically it makes more sense, because what are you about to do with squat, bench, deadlift? You're about to move. You're moving the range of motion. So even with your warming up, you're basically practicing how you're about to play, which to me makes far more sense as far as that.
For sure.
And then last thing, Derek, as far as just like, alternatives, right? Can you just like give a few examples of like maybe specific dynamic movements that would maybe be good for powerlifters specifically? And then I'll have a few clips of these movements popping up on screen so they can see that.
Oh, for sure. I think, let's say you're gonna go in a squat, right? I think any kind of squat that you can do that's gonna help you get through a full range of motion would be great to do. So whether that's like a goblet squat, a Zercher squat with like a low hanging goblet squat, a curtsy lunge, which is like a cross behind lunge, getting down deep into it. Any kind of squat variation or movement you can do. I've seen people do like heel elevated, like squeezing a foam roller. And to me, like, I don't think either any of these things are doing anything special. I think maybe they're just helping you find positions to get into those deep ranges of motion. Right. To me, going into like a deep, full range of motion in anything is gonna better prepare you than stretching.
Right.
And going through a controlled range of motion, whether it's loaded, body weight, it'll be much better for your like range of motion and getting you ready to go lift than sitting in a static position for 30 seconds, a minute, however long you hold that static stretch or foam rolling.
Right, and then for bench press, what I usually have people do is just some basic upper body movements. Yeah, like if I do something like even just taking the bar for a few reps, push-ups, banded face pull with external rotation, or even just taking my arms, just protracting and retracting. Bench usually doesn't take a whole lot for me to warm up, but outside of that, is that about what you would recommend for that as well?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, that's all I would recommend as well. Like I said, any loaded movement, any active movement is going to be better than stretching. Like I said, we'll show a couple examples, but any movement you can do that I feel like is going to get you into an end range under control, not just like flopping into it, but controlled end range. And your end range is going to be great for warming you up. Yeah. And the same thing with deadlifts, guys. Like usually 9 times out of 10, whatever you're doing to warm up for your squat, it's gonna get you warm up for your deadlift. Like if you pull sumo, usually you're warm for your sumo from squatting anyway. And if you pull conventional, it's even simpler than that. Just doing some basic like hinges, like you used to do on light dumbbell RDLs or just with the bar, just to practice getting in that position, is going to 1, save you time. 2, we know from the research it's going to help your performance, right? So not only because you said, the group that did nothing versus the group that did do dynamic work. The group that did dynamic work got a performance increase, it seems. So we're not saying not to warm up at all, but we're simply saying that make sure it's movement-based and dynamic in nature, because that's going to give you the increase in performance, save you time, and quite possibly, as more research comes out, help you with even maintaining more hypertrophy long-term versus short-chaining yourself. So yeah. And I think that's pretty much the main points we wanted to cover, right? Yeah, I think so, yeah.
Yeah. So first of all, we apologize. I think we said like on Instagram a few months ago that we were gonna do. But hey man, y'all know 22 is kind of crazy, man. My boy was still finishing up PT school. Our schedules weren't finding alignment.
I was in Colorado last summer, and it was gonna be like a Skype thing, and I was like, I don't really want to do a Zoom thing. It was mainly me. It wasn't Marcel's. Marcel's is on his stuff.
I appreciate Derek coming through.
Yeah.
Like I said, if you guys aren't following him, definitely be sure to do so. Even now, he's constantly posting stuff on his story related to like physical therapy, and like I said, really just doing a good job of bridging the gap between strength training and physical therapists. Right now, there's a lot of powerlifting coaches who just hate physical therapists because their clients will go to a physical therapist, and the physical therapist will do a bunch of manual stuff and be like, "Oh, stay away from squats, stay away from deadlifting, don't lift that much." Which obviously, as a coach, is like, "Yo, that's not helping us at all, right?" And on the flip side, you got some powerlifting coaches who don't know quite as much as what they think they do, who want to make it seem like physical therapists are null and void, which also isn't the case. So I definitely appreciate my boy Derek. I really do believe he's going to be one of the best PTs in the Dallas-Fort Worth area of Texas. Really, just one of the best PTs, period. So I look forward to that. But appreciate you coming on the channel, man. But yeah, guys, that is it for this video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you did, go leave a comment down below and let me know what you did. If you not, leave a comment down below, let me know what I or Derek can do to get better. Like the video, share, subscribe. Keep it simple, specific, scientific. I'll catch you. Go ahead and flex with me, man. We'll catch y'all later.
Ooh, see? Ooh.